Emily Rodriguez had always been the black sheep of the prestigious Whitmore family. While her siblings pursued careers that aligned with their father's expectations, law, medicine, corporate finance, Emily chose to work as a social worker in the immigrant community of East Hartford. Her decision to date Marcus Kim, a Korean-American chef who ran a small family restaurant, had created an irreparable rift with her wealthy, conservative family. The trouble began when Emily's father, Richard Whitmore, discovered her relationship. As the owner of several upscale hotels and a prominent figure in the city's business community, Richard believed his daughter was throwing her life away and embarrassing the family name. When Emily refused to end the relationship, Richard made a devastating decision. He cut off her trust fund, removed her from the family will, and used his influence to have her fired from her position at the county social services department. Within weeks, Emily found herself struggling to make ends meet. Her small apartment rent became impossible to manage, and she was forced to move into a cramped studio in a rundown building owned by Vincent Morrison, a slumlord who preyed on desperate tenants. Morrison was notorious for his discriminatory practices, deliberately making life miserable for tenants he deemed undesirable, particularly immigrants and interracial couples. Emily's situation worsened when Morrison discovered her relationship with Marcus. He began a campaign of harassment that included surprise inspections at odd hours, deliberately delaying maintenance requests, and finding excuses to threaten eviction. When Emily's heating broke during a particularly harsh winter, Morrison refused to fix it, claiming she was behind on rent, a lie, as Emily had documentation proving her payments were current. Desperate and nearly broken, Emily began volunteering at a local homeless shelter to at least get warm meals. It was there she met David Chen, a quiet man in his 50s who appeared to be just another down-on-his-luck individual seeking refuge from the cold. David was soft-spoken, well-educated, and seemed oddly out of place among the typical shelter residents. He claimed to be a traveling businessman who had fallen on hard times, but something about his demeanor suggested there was more to his story. Emily took David under her wing, sharing her own meager resources and helping him navigate the shelter system. She never asked too many questions about his background, respecting his privacy as she hoped others would respect hers. David was grateful for her kindness and began to see firsthand the injustices Emily faced daily, from Morrison's harassment to her family's cold rejection of her attempts to reconcile. As winter deepened, Morrison's harassment escalated. He began showing up at Emily's workplace, a part-time job at a local community center, making complaints to her supervisor about her character and association with undesirable elements. He spread rumors throughout the building that Emily was involved in illegal activities, causing other tenants to view her with suspicion. The final straw came when Morrison entered her apartment without notice and claimed to find evidence of lease violations, including unauthorized guests, referring to the times Marcus had stayed overnight. Morrison served Emily with an eviction notice, giving her just 10 days to vacate. The notice was filed during the holiday season when most legal aid offices were closed, making it nearly impossible for Emily to find help. She was facing homelessness just as temperatures dropped to dangerous lows. Her family remained unmoved by her pleas for temporary help, with her father stating that she had made her choices and needed to live with the consequences. During this crisis, David observed everything with growing anger. He had been staying at the shelter longer than most temporary residents, and Emily had become like a daughter to him. He watched her grow thinner as she skipped meals to afford basic necessities, saw her spirit break a little more each day as Morrison's harassment continued, and witnessed her struggle to maintain her dignity while facing homelessness. David began asking careful questions about Morrison's business practices and Emily's landlord troubles. He learned about Morrison's pattern of discrimination, his numerous housing code violations, and his practice of targeting vulnerable tenants. David also discovered the extent of Richard Whitmore's influence in the community and how he had orchestrated Emily's professional and personal isolation. One evening, as Emily broke down crying about her impossible situation, David made a decision. He revealed that he wasn't actually homeless or down on his luck. David Chen was a successful real estate developer and investor from California who had been in Hartford researching potential business opportunities. He had been staying at the shelter as part of his research into housing inequality and urban development issues, a practice he had developed to truly understand the communities where he invested. Emily was initially hurt by the deception, feeling that David had been studying her like a subject rather than genuinely caring about her situation. David explained that while his initial presence at the shelter had been research-related, his friendship with Emily had become completely genuine. He had watched her show kindness and resilience in the face of systematic cruelty, and he couldn't stand by and watch her be destroyed by people who abused their power. David revealed the full extent of his resources and connections. He wasn't just wealthy. He was extraordinarily influential in real estate circles and had connections throughout the housing and development industry. More importantly, he had been quietly documenting everything he had witnessed and learned about Morrison's illegal practices and Richard Whitmore's abuse of his business connections to harm his own daughter. David's plan was methodical and devastating. First, he purchased Morrison's building and several other properties in the landlord's portfolio through a shell company, effectively making himself Morrison's new boss. The purchases were conducted so quickly and quietly that Morrison had no idea what was happening until the deals were completed. David then initiated a comprehensive audit of all properties, discovering extensive housing code violations, discriminatory practices, and financial irregularities that Morrison had been hiding for years. While dealing with Morrison, David also began investigating Richard Whitmore's business practices. Using his industry connections, David discovered that Whitmore's hotel empire had several vulnerabilities, including some questionable land deals and potential conflicts of interest with city development projects. David began positioning himself as a competing developer, using his superior resources and cleaner business practices to systematically outbid Whitmore on lucrative contracts. The first phase of David's revenge began when Morrison received notice that his employment as property manager was terminated immediately. All of his properties had been sold, and the new ownership had found his management practices unacceptable. Morrison was also informed that he was being investigated for housing discrimination, and that several former tenants were being encouraged to file complaints with housing authorities. Emily watched in amazement as her apartment was suddenly repaired and renovated. The new management company, which she didn't initially realize was owned by David, not only fixed her heating, but upgraded her entire unit. Her rent was reduced to reflect the actual value of what she had been receiving, and she received a substantial refund for overpayments during Morrison's mismanagement. Morrison, meanwhile, found himself facing multiple lawsuits and investigations. His reputation in the property management industry was destroyed, and he was forced to take a minimum wage job while dealing with mounting legal bills. The man who had once wielded his petty authority to make Emily's life miserable was now experiencing the powerlessness he had inflicted on others. David's campaign against Richard Whitmore was more sophisticated and took longer to unfold. Using his legitimate business credentials, David began competing directly with Whitmore's hotel chain. He opened boutique hotels that emphasized community engagement and cultural diversity, values that directly contradicted Whitmore's exclusionary practices. David's hotels quickly gained popularity, particularly among younger travelers and business professionals who valued social responsibility. More damaging to Whitmore was David's investigation into his business practices. David discovered that Whitmore had been using his influence to manipulate city zoning decisions and had connections to several development projects that may have involved corruption. David carefully documented these findings and began sharing them with investigative journalists and ethics watchdog organizations. The pressure on Whitmore intensified when David began recruiting Emily's former colleagues and clients to work at community outreach programs funded by his hotel chain. These programs highlighted the exact type of social work that Emily had been doing, work that Whitmore had dismissed as worthless. The contrast between David's community investment and Whitmore's elitist attitudes became a public relations nightmare for the Whitmore brand. Emily initially felt uncomfortable with the extent of David's intervention in her life. She worried that accepting his help made her no different from her family, dependent on wealth and influence to solve her problems. David helped her understand that there was a crucial difference between using resources to help someone grow and using them to control or manipulate. He encouraged Emily to pursue her master's degree in social work, offering to fund her education not as charity, but as an investment in someone whose work would benefit entire communities. As Emily's life stabilized and began to improve, she also found the strength to rebuild her relationship with Marcus, whose restaurant business had suffered during their difficult period. David, recognizing Marcus's talent and the cultural value of his family's recipes, became an investor in the restaurant, helping it expand into a successful chain that celebrated Korean-American cuisine and culture. The transformation wasn't just about revenge. It was about creating positive change that benefited everyone except those who had abused their power. Emily returned to school and eventually opened her own nonprofit organization focused on housing rights and immigrant services. Marcus's restaurants became gathering places that brought diverse communities together. David's hotels became models for socially responsible business practices. The final phase of David's plan unfolded over several months as various investigations into Richard Whitmore's business practices began to bear fruit. City ethics committees launched inquiries into several development deals where Whitmore appeared to have had inappropriate influence. The hotel chain began losing major contracts as corporate clients moved their business to more progressive competitors like David's establishments. Whitmore's attempts to repair his reputation were undermined by his past actions becoming public knowledge. Former employees came forward with stories of discriminatory hearing practices and workplace harassment. Community leaders who had witnessed his treatment of Emily and his dismissive attitude toward social services began speaking publicly about his character. The breaking point came when Emily's story, her journey from family rejection to community leadership, was featured in a major newspaper article about housing discrimination and family dysfunction among the wealthy. The article didn't mention Whitmore by name, but everyone in their social circle knew exactly who was being described. The contrast between Emily's resilience and her father's cruelty became a topic of conversation in the very social circles where Whitmore had once been respected. Morrison's downfall was more immediate and personal. Facing multiple lawsuits and having lost his primary source of income, he was forced to move into the same type of substandard housing he had once maintained. He experienced firsthand the broken heating, unreliable plumbing, and invasive management practices that he had inflicted on others. The irony wasn't lost on his former tenants, several of whom made sure to document his living conditions and share them within the community. Emily's family situation became more complex as her siblings began to recognize the injustice of her treatment. Her younger sister, Rebecca, reached out privately, expressing regret for not supporting Emily during her crisis. Rebecca revealed that other family members had been uncomfortable with their father's extreme reaction, but had been afraid to speak up against his authority. David encouraged Emily to be open to reconciliation with family members who genuinely wanted to rebuild their relationships, while maintaining boundaries with those who hadn't changed their attitudes. Emily's success and resilience had shifted the family dynamics, forcing everyone to confront the consequences of their choices during her time of need. 2 years after Emily's darkest winter, the transformation was complete. Emily had graduated with her master's degree, and her nonprofit was making a real difference in the community. Her housing rights advocacy had led to new city ordinances protecting tenants from discriminatory practices. Marcus's restaurant chain had become a symbol of successful immigrant entrepreneurship, and their relationship had grown stronger through their shared struggles. Morrison had disappeared from the Hartford area entirely, unable to find work in property management, and facing ongoing legal consequences for his discriminatory practices. His former tenants had organized into an advocacy group that monitored landlord behavior and supported other vulnerable renters. Richard Whitmore's business empire had contracted significantly. Several hotels had been sold to cover legal expenses and declining revenues. His influence in city politics had evaporated as ethics investigations had revealed the extent of his inappropriate business relationships. Most painfully for him, his social standing had been permanently damaged as community leaders distanced themselves from his discriminatory attitudes. The ultimate irony was that Whitmore's attempts to punish Emily for her choices had led to her achieving far more success and respect than she might have otherwise. Her story had inspired others facing family rejection and discrimination, and her nonprofit work had gained national attention. She had become exactly the kind of community leader that civic organizations celebrated, the opposite of everything her father represented. David had achieved his goal of justice, but more importantly, he had helped create positive change that extended far beyond the original situation. His investment in Emily's education and Marcus's business had generated economic opportunities for entire communities. His hotel chain's commitment to social responsibility had influenced other businesses to adopt more progressive practices. Emily's relationship with David had evolved into a genuine friendship and professional partnership. She served on the board of his foundation, helping to direct resources toward housing advocacy and immigrant services. Their collaboration demonstrated how wealth and influence could be used to empower others rather than control them. The story concluded not with dramatic confrontations or explosive revelations, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives rebuilt and injustices addressed. Emily stood in her new office, looking out at the community center that housed her nonprofit organization. The building had been purchased and renovated by David's foundation, but the programs and services were entirely Emily's vision. Marcus joined her in the office, bringing coffee and updates from the restaurant's latest community event. Their relationship had not only survived the crisis, but had grown stronger because they had faced adversity together rather than allowing it to divide them. They had learned that love wasn't just about supporting each other during good times, but about maintaining loyalty and commitment when external forces tried to tear them apart. David's approach to justice had been methodical rather than vindictive. He hadn't sought to destroy Morrison and Whitmore out of spite, but had used his resources to ensure they faced the natural consequences of their actions while preventing them from harming others. Morrison's housing discrimination had led to his removal from the industry and legal accountability. Whitmore's abuse of business influence had resulted in lost contracts and damaged reputation. The broader community had benefited from David's interventions. Housing standards had improved across multiple properties. Emily's advocacy work had strengthened tenant protections. Marcus's restaurants had created jobs and cultural bridges between communities. David's business practices had demonstrated that financial success and social responsibility weren't mutually exclusive. Emily's family relationships remained complicated but had evolved. Rebecca and one of her brothers had rebuilt genuine relationships with Emily, while her father remained distant and proud. Emily had learned that she couldn't control her family's choices, but she could control her own responses and build the type of community she wanted to be part of. The final scene showed Emily, Marcus, and David at a community celebration honoring local social justice advocates. Emily was receiving an award for her housing rights work, but she used her speech to recognize the many people who had supported her journey. She spoke about the importance of using whatever resources and privileges one had to lift others up rather than tear them down. As the evening ended, Emily reflected on how her darkest period had led to her greatest growth. The injustices she had faced had been real and painful, but they had also revealed her own strength and connected her with people who shared her values. She had learned that true power came not from family wealth or social position, but from the ability to create positive change in the world around her. The traveler she had saved, David, hadn't just been watching her struggle. He had been learning from her example of grace under pressure and deciding to use his own advantages to support rather than exploit. Their unlikely friendship had become a model for how people with different backgrounds and resources could work together to address systemic problems and create lasting change.